Hey guys, Ellen Munsell here, and for my final project, I decided to do an in-depth study into of the most important women in the founding era, who would be Abigail Adams and Mercy Otis Warren. And what makes these women interesting is that they're actually not the women we traditionally think of when we think of revolutionary women. Mercy Otis Warren is probably one of the most underappreciated characters in American history. She was an avid writer and she was firmly involved in most of what happened, especially in Massachusetts in the early Revolutionary period. Both of these women, I think, deserve the title of probably founding mothers, but we haven't really started to really dive into the annals of our history and start to discover where we're really lacking in our understanding. And I think particularly these women show how short-sighted our understanding of American revolutionary characters are. Both of them were strong in their own rights. Both of them had thoughts in their own rights. Although they both married political men, in the end, their thoughts were really their own. So, Mercy Otis Warren and Abigail Adams are just two of the examples of the incredibly gifted women of the Revolutionary period. We oftentimes don't think about the women who were also participants in this war, whether it was keeping track of what was going on at the farm, keeping the children healthy, fleeing sieges, whether it was sending off what little they could to their husbands and their sons fighting in the war. Women actually had a huge part in the success of the Revolutionary War. Now, what makes Abigail and Mercy Otis Warren kind of different than just the average housewife of the period is that they both were avid writers and actually advocated strongly with their words for the Revolutionary War. Both were born in Massachusetts. Abigail Adams, who was actually born a Smith, was born in 1744, and Mercy Otis Warren was born in 1728. So their age difference is something that does come in and factor into what they actually do in their lifetimes. Mercy Otis Warren is a far more outspoken advocate for the Revolutionary War, and that may be because when a lot of the lead up to it was happening, she was older than Abigail was. When the Stamp Act happened in 1765, Abigail Adams had just married John Adams, and she was barely 20 years old. So you have to keep in mind that their involvement, especially in that early Revolutionary period, is very indicative of how old they actually were. Neither woman would actually receive a formal education, but both of them would still be incredibly educated. It was not common in this time period for women to be educated, but Mercy Otis Warren was allowed to study alongside her brothers under the tutelage, I guess, of Reverend Jonathan Russell. And what makes it interesting is she was allowed to learn everything that they were allowed to learn except for Greek and Latin. Kind of a random exclusion, but interesting nonetheless. Same thing with Abigail Adams as well. She didn't have any formal education, but she would be an avid reader. She would read everything from William Shakespeare to John Milton. And if you ever read any of her correspondence with Mercy Otis Warren or with John Adams, it becomes readily apparent actually how intelligent she is and how well read she is and how well learned she is. There are a lot of allusions to historical facts from the fall of Rome to a lot of the mythology of the Roman period actually crop up in a lot of her writing. So she's obviously very educated, and both of these women are very educated. Both would marry men in politics. Mercy Otis Warren married James Warren, a merchant and a farmer, who would serve in the Massachusetts state legislature. And obviously, we all know Abigail Adams married John Adams, and he would obviously be part of the Continental Congress that would actually make the Declaration of Independence, and then he would go on to be president later on in his lifetime. Both would actually have 5 children. Unfortunately for Abigail Adams, only 4 of the 5 would survive until adulthood. And Abigail, of note, she married John when she was only 20, and Mercy Otis Warren actually got married a lot later for the time period, near her 30s, which is very old for that age. Although both women had political husbands, their draw to politics was their own, and they possessed their own ideas about it. They possess ideas about the Stamp Act of 1765 all the way up through the federal American government that we have today. Mercy Otis Warren would continue writing even past the Revolutionary War and was a advocate for anti-federalism. She didn't like the federal system, but ultimately that would come into play. Mercy Otis Warren was drawn into politics after her brother, the political firebrand James Otis, was beaten by the Colonial Revenue Office in 1769. She would host protest meetings in her home and created the Committee of Correspondence. So her advocacy for the Revolutionary War is actually something that happens very early on in the Revolution. Abigail would also find her political voice, though younger than Mercy Otis Warren during the early Revolutionary period. Her and John were married the same year as the Stamp Act, as I said before, and she would have been only 20 at the time. She had extensive sway over John, and they wrote over 1,000 letters to one another in their lifetime. She also bore the brunt of the revolution at home on the home front. John would be gone at the Continental Congress and later as part of the envoy for peace in Paris. So she would actually raise their children, deal with the illness, deal with a lot of the day-to-day things that had to be dealt with that allowed John Adams to go on and actually participate in the Revolutionary War in the capacity that he did. Mercy Otis Warren held far more public views, though, writing 3 satirical plays that took direct aim at the royal governor, Thomas Hutchinson of Massachusetts. Her first play, The Adulator, foretold the Revolutionary War. Rapatio, the character that was modeled after Thomas Hutchinson, would be the catalyst of the revolt in Servia, the mythical kingdom that this entire play was placed in. Her brother James was the protagonist of her first play and went under the name Brutus, and he would fight against Rapatio. She also foretold the bloodshed of the Revolutionary War when she writes, "Murders, blood, and carnage shall crimson all the streets." She followed this up with The Defeat, which was one of her secondary play, and what she called Rapatio, "dangerous foe of liberty, of truth, and of mankind." And interestingly enough, the names of her characters would be substituted in for the leaders, for Thomas Hutchinson, and the leaders of the Revolutionary War and their political correspondence between these patriots would actually use the names that she had given to these characters. So her effect was obviously very widespread, and everyone kind of knew, especially the leading patriots in Massachusetts, knew that the writer, although she published under an anonymous name to avoid British reprisal, they all knew that it was Mercy Otis Warren. They knew that she was the writer, and she took square aim straight at what she saw as problematic in this period. Abigail and Mercy Otis Warren would strike up one of the most beautiful correspondences I think I've ever read, and especially of this period. Although not often acknowledged as part of the freedom documents of our nation's founding, they demonstrate a crucial aspect of the war, the home front. And what I mean by that is that they would talk about things from revolutionary ideas to the importance of women in politics to day-to-day, the sickness of their children, the introductions between people who would be coming into different places because of the Revolutionary War. They really took up the front, the home front, and were oftentimes the most important aspects of that. In their letters, they talk of revolutionary ideals. In 1775, Abigail writes, "Heaven only knows what is next to take place, but it seems to me the sword is now our only yet dreadful alternative." She also, in the same letter, compares the British Empire to the fall of Rome and makes not very covered allusions to the fact that Britain is going to fall in the same way that Rome did. She also writes in the same letter of her anxiety for John Adams. Obviously, at this point, he's become a very forward speaker about the Revolutionary War. She understood what he was doing, but also clearly states how difficult it was for her. Both of these women definitely understood the time period that they lived in, and they served as companion and thoughts to one another. They very much encouraged one another in their revolutionary ideas, but also the important things in the daily life that they live. They both had very sick children at different points. They dealt with the introduction of people, and their word mattered a lot to not only one another, but to people in their community. They were both leading women in Massachusetts, and especially when their husbands were gone or busy with other things, they would continue to be these leading characters in the political scene in Massachusetts. Following the war, Mercy Otis Warren would write a 3-volume history of the Revolutionary War that sharply criticized John Adams, who she was also frequently in correspondence with. They had their own set of correspondence. So not only was Mercy Otis Warren friends with Abigail Adams, but she was also friends with John Adams. And this would actually lead to a breach of their friendship from 1805 to 1812. Both women lived incredible lives and are representative of an entire group of people, political women with their own leanings who advocated for revolution even before it was popular. Their thoughts ought to be considered as just as important as the men of the era. Both women advocated in their own way, Mercy Otis Warren very publicly, though anonymous in her writing, and Abigail Adams to a leading revolutionary. They both had their own ideas and they both advocated strongly for them. In their later life, Abigail Adams would go on to be first woman from 1796 to 1800, and she died in 1818, and Mercy Otis Warren would die in 1814. The long and the short of it is, both of these women lived incredible lives that deserve to be remembered and deserve to be among those who led the Revolutionary War. And so I hope that you guys learned something about them and about not only what they did during the Revolutionary War, but before and after it. And I hope that this was insightful. Thank you.